everyone. Welcome back to the Booklore podcast, where we explore the power of literature and celebrate diverse voices in North Carolina by spotlighting local writers. I suggest you cozy up, grab a matcha or any drink of your choice, and tune in. I'll be your host, Christina. Today, we have the privilege of inviting Eric Tran onto this episode. Eric is the award-winning queer Vietnamese poet and writer of the collections Mouth, Sugar, and Smoke and The Gutter Spread Guide to Prayer, as well as the chapbooks Revisions and Affairs with Men in Suits. Additionally, he is a graduate of both UNC Wilmington and UNC School of Medicine, completed his residency in Asheville, and is currently calling in from Portland, Oregon. Thank you so much for joining us today, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Mm-hmm. So to start us off with our first question, just please introduce yourself in your own words, just your hobbies, your occupation, family, anything to start us off.
Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Eric Tran. Currently calling in from a work break. I'm a practicing psychiatrist out in Portland, Oregon, with some emphasis in addiction psychiatry. I spent the majority of my graduate work in medicine, but as Christina mentioned, I also studied creative writing right after college, and I also studied English and creative writing in college as well. I consider myself mostly a poet, but I trained in essay writing. And right now I'm reading mostly comic books and fiction. So I think genre is a made up thing, and we should enjoy whatever we like.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So to start us off with our first formal questions, would you be able to tell us a bit more about your background and relationship with reading and writing growing up? Just essentially your journey towards becoming a published poet and writer today. So that can include.
Yeah. Go
That
ahead.
can include what people and authors and literature have inspired you.
Yeah, that was a good addendum to that question. Thank you. My family moved over to the U.S. from Vietnam as immigrants during the war. So they have a background, at least my mother's side of the family has a background in education. I think a majority of my family were school teachers. And despite moving here and then having to pick up, I guess what we would consider more blue collar or working class jobs that weren't as literary, they still had a lot of emphasis on learning and particularly reading for pleasure. So despite the fact that we were like actually quite poor, I remember always going into bookstores and just having this feeling of like, oh, I could get any book or any number of books that I want here, and somehow we will find a way to make this work. That said, I spent most of my time in libraries, and I distinctly remember like having like going to the library with like giant hefty bags, like actual garbage bags to pull home my books. And when we would do that to like save us the number of trips we would have to go per time hauling these books, I was sorry, there's a car next to me. I was put on a restriction of how many books I could read per day, just because I would go through them so fast. So I think, like many writers, I mean, hopefully all writers, but many writers, the instinct to write comes from the fact that really what I would just prefer to do in my life is read. Authors who I think influenced me a lot. I mean, I think it's all the time that I'm reading people who teach me about writing. I feel like, despite the fact that I've been doing this now for what is this like on like going on my 25th, 30th year of writing pretty regularly. It's almost like I wake up every day not knowing anything, which is pretty frustrating, but also allows just sort of this humility of like I get to relearn the art just constantly from everyone that I'm reading. People I'm reading right now, I think perennial favorites would be like Ocean Wong, Chen Chen, Franny Choi, Jessica Stark, a lot of contemporary Asian American queer writers, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some great names. I've definitely loved their works as well, along with yours. Our next question, have you found any intersection or balance between your work as a writer and your work in psychiatry? How have these two passions sort of woven together in your daily life? or identity, or are they sort of separate outlets for different purposes?
Yeah, that's a funny question of like identities and boundaries, right? Like in some ways, I
Mhm.
think that boundaries are porous and are uh, objectively artificial things that we've created. Like I think a lot about Everything Everywhere All at Once, the movie where multiverses are more porous than we think. Um, and to that degree, I think that any time we try to distinguish times, people, passions, groups, we're doing it artificially. And the
Mhm.
question is like, to what purpose are we doing that? So to a degree, I think that my work life, my personal life, and my artistic life, I have created boundaries and have adhered to them really strongly previously, where the boundaries served to protect time for each of those things. So that
Mhm.
would mean, like for example, in like sort of the toughest days of medical school, I wake up at like 5 a.m. so I could write for an hour. And the reason I woke up at 5 and did it during that time was like no one else could demand that time be used for medicine, or no one was awake enough to demand that time be used for, like tending to other things in my life. I needed that protection in order to learn my crafts better. Otherwise, I didn't have enough practice or discipline or confidence to be able to attend to each of those things independently. Now I sort of think of them as not different aspects of myself, but wholly representations of the same self. So I've been writing a lot into love. I've been thinking a lot about how love is the center of why people come to mental health care, or what they're seeking from it, and how much love is at the core of who I am as just a person holistically. And so to that degree, I do think that there are distinguishments to make, but in other ways, like this is all the same person. Like there's nothing different about them.
Yeah, understood. Uh, that was a great answer. Our next question is about your debut collection, The Gutter Spread Guide to Prayer, which explored the ideas of grief, sexuality, poetry as prayer, and more, all through a fascinating lens of comic book allusions and pop culture and current events. Could you tell us a bit more about this publication story, the inspiration, any like queering or agents, if you went through that?
Yeah, that book and my second book were actually written simultaneously in the sense that they're just not just, but they're an accumulation of the writing that I did for those 10, 12, 15 years. Um, I I think a big adage of when I was in my Master's of Fine Arts was write what you're obsessed about. Um, and I don't even think we need that encouragement, right? Like if you're obsessed about something, you're writing about something, you're trying to figure something out, or you're trying to find it, more curiosity, more knowledge, more questions. So to that degree, the book was born out of this obsession that I had and still have of how do you live and love in an identity or in a world that seems necessarily doomed towards tragedy. So growing up, I mean, I still think of myself as growing up right now. I've had so many queer men in my life die of deaths of despair. And the question I have is very little of what I've done in my life is different from theirs. Why am I spared? Or what about what I love doing or we love doing or part of our culture or part of our identity necessitates that we are sort of always living towards disaster? And if we are all living on the edge of disaster because we are, how do we still find joy in that or because of that? And so those books bore out sort of two different versions, I guess, of the same question and obsession. Um, in terms of the logistics and nitty gritty of it, um, I I feel that there was a point in my life where having a book seemed like an impossibility, like
Mhm.
both this validation of being this misfit person with something that could have something that's so codified as prestige as a book just never seemed like a reality to me. So I just constantly wrote poems with the vague idea that I wanted a book, but not really the belief that it would happen. And in some ways, I think that that kind of relieved the pressure of always having to see a final project or a final product. I focused a lot more, I think, on like what did I still have to learn about individual poems or the idea of poem writing in general. Um, so when I finally arrived to having enough poems to submit a book, I just caught me by surprise. Um, and I was very fortunate in that I submitted it to a handful of contests, which is how most poetry books get published. And it won a first book contest, which is often how a lot of debut authors get their start. It's rare to get your book sold through an agent. It's definitely possible,
Hmm.
but because poetry books are less, I think, lucrative or bestsellers than fiction or memoirs or essays, um, agents sort of have less to gain based on selling a poetry book. You can also query directly to some of the bigger presses,
Hmm.
um, but the majority of us get it through open reading periods or through contests.
Yeah, that's some great insight. Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned it earlier, but your second collection, Mouth, Sugar, and Smoke, was published just last summer and also
Hmm.
tackles core topics of lust, desire, and the multidimensional experiences of the Asian, diasporic, queer, and medical professional identity. So,
Hmm.
what does
Hmm.
poetry and prose mean to you as an art form to express oneself and create statements?
I think, I think art is less about self-expression, though certainly we could say that. I think it's about imagination. So said another way, I don't think artists have brilliant statements to make, but they have brilliant questions to ask. Um, I've been sort of thinking about what radical imagination means, and that's sort of like a cliche phrase now, I guess, but I think all the time of like we could imagine a world like what would happen if we imagined our world differently. So let's say in poetry in particular, I kind of conceptualize poetry as being this this art form that involves words and language. Language is given to us or taught to us as having a particular set of rules, right? Like it goes subject, verb, object, and then there's like, articles and prepositions thrown in there, but they follow a specific order to have, function in our society. But poetry asks, what happens if we can what happens if we allow ourselves to imagine that words and language work in different ways too? How does that free us from some of the expectations that we have here? What can we imagine ourselves as if we give ourselves this kind of freedom? So in the book of Mouth, Sugar, and Smoke, I think that there is some acknowledgement of the consequences that we have of the rules imposed upon us, but what also exists if we embrace lyricism, if we embrace the ability to say that language doesn't have to mean what we're told it to mean, what happens if we give it the room to be what it wants to be or what it could
Yeah, thank you. I definitely should have um, added those thoughts in my questions. I mean, in my question about the idea of art also just being a way to express wonderings and questions about this universe and just definitions and all of that. Um, Next question is, so what does your creative process look like for like individual pieces, like deciding prose,
be.
scheme styles, and specific ideas?
Mm. I think right now I'm very lucky that I've managed to get two books out in such a short period of time. And I think that's because I just had such a voluminous collection that actually broke into two different distinct collections um, that I feel that I've really just accomplished more than I thought that I ever would or could ever want. And in that, I feel this distinctive blessing to say, okay, well, you published two books that, had accolade that, changed my life in many ways, and in other ways didn't change very much about my life, right? And if that's the case, that I am freed from poetry having to pay the bills or give me some access to something that I need to survive or achieve a happy life, what can how can I engage with poetry then? Like what do I have access to now that I'm freed? And right now I'm sort of um, pondering this sort of very basic but I think evergreen question for all of us is what does it look like to be happy? Um,
Mhm.
what does it look like to approach poetry for joy? I mean, poetry itself is not always joyful. Like I think, sort of stereotype is that poetry is always so sad, which, maybe it is. But how can I approach writing it or engaging with it in a way that brings me joy as opposed to feeling like another task or a job that I have to do? So previously, when it was sort of more task oriented, I sort of alluded to the fact that I made sure to write every day because I was still developing a lot of muscles, developing a lot of discipline, developing a lot of boundaries to make sure that it was alive and well in my life. But now that it has proven to be those things, and while I'm no master, I certainly feel practiced enough that I don't feel rusty. Um, I think about what curiosities do I have here? What joys do I have here? And rather than thinking of how do I complete a poem, how do I complete a book, I think about like where can I just pursue joy right
Mhm. Yeah, understood. So we're rounding off with our last few questions. So what common goal or theme amongst, I guess, all your works, if you can sort of find a connecting theme, do you hope readers take away from the most?
now? It's so funny. I think there's this kind of like um, really interesting, I guess, philosophy that I um, have found from other writers that we're always either trying to replicate or revise one piece of writing that we have or replicate a piece of writing that we love and has always seemed to elude our skill level. And I just think it's very funny that I have this poem that I want to write, but yet, I've been unable to write for, decades. And I think one of the refrains that just sort of pops through my head and went through my head is like, again, a very sort of simple phrase, but one that is maybe difficult to render in a way that feels earnest and authentic, um, but also artful is just the phrase I love you. So whether or not that's apparent in my work right now or it takes me more volumes of poetry to write, I think that is um, a big motivator for me.
Mhm. All right. And we have our last question. So, lastly, do you have any advice for young writers and poets today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about finding your own balance of um, what discipline you need to have, what structure you need to have, what rules you need to follow, but also recognizing that these, again, are artificial things that other people are imposing or suggesting for you. At the end of the day, to quote from that movie again, Everything Ever All at Once, at the end of the day, nothing matters. We can do whatever we want.
Mhm.
And rather than waiting for years and years to give yourself permission to do that, if you can embrace joy right now, I promise you, that's all the success you need.
Yeah, that's totally so resonating with me and all of our listeners, hopefully. So please feel free to use this remaining time to shout out anything from where we can find you, your socials, any upcoming news, projects,
Yeah,
or just anything
yeah,
under the sun.
absolutely. On social medias, I usually use the handle Rebel REBEL in Slacks SLACKS. We have I have been toying with moving away from Twitter,
Mhm.
so you can find me on Blue Sky under just my first and my last name. I don't have any poems coming out, but I have been doing a lot of readings and hosting some panels out in Portland, Oregon.
Mhm.
So I guess what I would suggest you do is just attend your local readings, shop at your independent bookstores, and find books at your local library.
Yeah, all right, awesome. Well, our time has come to a close, but thank you so much for all your incredible insights and answers today, Eric. It was truly such a pleasure having you here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Well, this is Booklore signing off. Thank you, everyone.